Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to episode 14 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics blog. As most of you know, I'm an attorney in Houston, and I have a solo practice focusing on compliance and ethics. I blog every day at the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report, and now I podcast on this site as well. Today, I'm extraordinarily pleased to actually be interviewed by my good friend and colleague Mary Flood, and I asked Mary if she would visit with me about a recent ebook I published, GSK in China, a Game Changer in Compliance, and why I think that the GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, matter in China that came up this summer is going to be a true game changer in compliance going forward. So Mary, could I turn it over to you?
Certainly. I'm happy to be here, and I really found your ebook interesting. I'm curious what caused you to first decide to write about the GSK China experience.
Sure. This matter came up right at the end of June and the 1st of July of this summer. And the thing that initially struck me was that we do not have typically public information about ongoing anti-bribery and anti-corruption enforcement efforts. So for instance, if the Department of Justice is investigating a company under the FCPA, or the UK Ministry of Justice is, or Serious Fraud Office I should say, is investigating a UK company under the UK Bribery Act, the company may be required to self-disclose that in a 10K or Q, but that's the only information that we would typically receive. Here, however, we just had an explosion of press releases, information, public information, basically all of which came from the Chinese government. It clearly demonstrated the difference in the Chinese and U.S. and other Western countries' legal systems. But because we had such a large amount of public information, I became interested in this. And as the case developed, certainly in the first 30 days, but maybe even the first 6 weeks, it was clear to me that this was a game changer in compliance going forward.
Well, I was very interested in some of the ways the bribes were working, especially through travel agencies, which at one point you quoted somebody calling them the ATMs of China. That was fascinating to me. So what exactly happened there with GSK in China?
GSK was alleged to have engaged in bribery of hospital administrators, doctors, physicians, pharmaceutical representatives, nurses, everyone in the medical system in China who could prescribe medicine. And the reason this is significant for U.S. jurisdiction under the FCPA is the FCPA, of course, prevents bribery of foreign governmental officials, but that includes state-owned enterprises. And in China, with its socialized medicine system, all of the folks that I just named in that chain are state-owned enterprise employees, so the FCPA covers them. But specifically, GSK got into trouble for a bribery scheme or set of schemes that may be unique to China, and that involves travel agencies. And you're right, travel agencies were recognized as ATMs in China. They were viewed a little bit differently than you and I might view a travel agency, where we would certainly go to them for help with a ticket, whether it be professional or business or personal travel. But in China, travel agencies put together large conferences. They get the hotels, they get all of the entertainment, they pay for all of the food, they arrange all of the travel, they pay the honorarium to speakers and attendees. And so their remit is actually much broader. And GSK was alleged to have funded one large travel agency in Shanghai over $500 million over about a 3 or 4 year period to set up conferences, and it turns out to, or at least allegations of paying bribes directly through other schemes as well.
Well, you mentioned that it was different because of all the information the Chinese government put out about this, but we have perp walks here in the United States too. How are these sort of Chinese perp walks different than what we're accustomed to?
Certainly, and it's interesting that you would bring up the perp walk, because the Chinese, of course, take it a step further, where they put the perps on television where they confess their sins in a self-cleansing mechanism that is unique probably to the Chinese Communist Party. Nevertheless, they prevented certain Western employees of the company from leaving the country, whether they took their passports or other means, but they prevented them from leaving. Then they put them under house arrest when there were actually no charges against them. So it was very publicly, they were going after people like the general counsel, like the chief financial officer, like actually the head of the Chinese subsidiary had left in June for reasons that are still not clear, but he wasn't allowed to go back into the country. So we had a very public announcement of people who were under investigation before they had even been charged. And then we had people on state-run television confessing to have engaged in these bribery schemes going forward. And every time, and GSK, to their credit, went to China. They said that they were going to work with the Chinese government. They apologized for engaging in conduct that may have violated Chinese law. But every time GSK tried to push back or even hinted at pushing back by claiming that this was just rogue employees or maybe even a rogue subsidiary, the Chinese government would just up the ante and publicly announce that GSK corporate in London knew about this and they sanctioned it. And GSK's in a war that they can't win.
Wow, that sounds fairly scary. Not only do we all now know about travel agencies, but the idea of being under house arrest when you're the general counsel of a UK company, that's really frightening. So why does this matter to others? Why did you call this a game changer?
This was the first time that we had seen China, I guess probably the second largest market behind the United States, prosecute Western companies for violations of Chinese domestic laws. Obviously, the FCPA applies outside the United States. It does not apply internally to the United States. It is not a U.S. domestic law for enforcement of domestic bribery and corruption. So we had China enforcing not a foreign-looking act. We had China enforcing their own set of domestic laws. That was number one. Number two, they were enforcing it against Western companies. I think it's in part of their overall campaign against bribery and corruption. There's been some very public trials of Chinese governmental officials and Communist Party officials, but this is the first time they focused on Western companies.
So if I understand correctly from your book, in the laws were there in China about bribery for a while, but they were only going after the people who accepted bribes, and now they're going after the people who gave the bribes, and it happens to be a foreign company. Is that correct?
Yes, you're absolutely right. This was the other major change was that they were going after the bribe givers, not necessarily just the bribe receivers, although they are still actively prosecuting numerous governmental officials, Chinese governmental officials as well.
And in this GSK case, did they prosecute the people who accepted the bribes from GSK as well?
There have been a couple of arrests. The travel agents, I think, agency owners have been put under arrest. I think one or two hospital administrators were arrested, but the focus so far in the GSK matter, and indeed 15 U.S. or Western pharmaceutical companies who are now under investigation, has all been against the Western companies.
And these confessions that you mentioned, are they like plea bargain deals, confessions in this country, or is it of a different, more coerced genre, or what is that?
I wouldn't say it's from a coerced genre. I would say it's more unique to the Chinese philosophy and the system. And I think that the Chinese believe that a public self-cleansing is the word they use, but public display of shame and humility as part of the overall healing process. Whether you agree with that philosophically or not, nevertheless, it's an important part of the Chinese system. We typically see those charged with crimes admit to their crimes publicly, and that's what we saw with Chinese GSK officials.
So what might this mean for changes is there a reason to believe that this could mean a change in any other company's approach to foreigners giving bribes in their country?
Sure. I think, and the reason I really wanted to write the book and get this message out is I think this is a true game changer. It's a true game changer in China, but I think other companies are going to look at this situation and draw the lesson that, we are perceived to have a problem with corruption in our country. And that maybe the problem is not our corrupt officials, but maybe the problem is these bad Western companies. And just maybe it's politically expedient for us to claim it's someone else who is causing this corruption, and we will go after those outside interests with our own domestic laws.
So that other companies might use the Chinese playbook to attack. And Will China make money off of this? I mean, are there going to be big fines when I talk about China making money, like DOJ, like the government here making money? But are there going to be big fines?
Typically, there in the FCPA world, there are very high fines, or they can be very high fines and penalties. The top five are all over $300 million in fines and penalties. We don't know what the Chinese penalties will be as yet because they haven't levied any, but they could be significant, and that is certainly a reason that other countries may follow the Chinese playbook. But for instance, India, it's one of the companies Alpine might follow this model. They are in an ongoing national debate about the nature of corruption in their country, and they may decide that all politics is local, and we're going to attack corruption by focusing on those who are paying the bribes, not those who are receiving it.
I could see how that would be pretty frightening to foreign companies. What did GSK do and not do right here? In your book, it sounded like they've got great compliance on paper, at least.
Right. GSK fell into the trap of seemingly believing that they had a best-class compliance program because they had a great paper program. GSK also, I think, is going to have additional problems, but it really compounds the entire story because of the following. In July of 2012, they signed a consent decree with the United States government for the payment of a fine and fraud in their marketing of their certain pharmaceutical products. That fine was $3 billion. That's the largest fine ever paid for fraud in marketing. As part of that settlement, they agreed to have a best practices compliance program, not only in the marketing area, but also in the anti-bribery and anti-corruption area, specifically the FCPA. So they had stated they were going to have the program. They were under a consent decree to have it. You would think with a $3 billion fine they would be paying attention to these sorts of things, and somehow they weren't.
So you're somebody in corporate, and you look at what's going on in China, and you've got everything, all these compliance things set down on your policies, and you know that they're good. You see travel agencies, that might not frighten you particularly. What did they do wrong at corporate then?
Every compliance program has obligations all up and down the chain within the corporation. Certainly those at the front line and the operational level in the countries need to be involved. But the corporate office also has a responsibility, and that responsibility is oversight. My wife has a great phrase. She calls it a second set of eyes. Whatever process you have, you need to have a second set of eyes on that. In the anti-corruption world, in the FCPA world, that means monitoring, that means auditing, that means testing. If you have a travel agent that receives $500 million in payments from you over a 2, 3, 4 year period, you need to go audit that travel agency to determine precisely what the services are, why you should have such a large spend with them. And that's probably the failure, most apparent failure from the corporate office, but it's also tone at the top. If it doesn't really matter how you do business, you've got to make your numbers. People get that message, and if the Chinese operation had the message that we have to make our numbers, that we have to grow, and the corporate office was turning a blind eye to that, that's a systemic failure of compliance.
Well, and the oil companies here we all know that there's certain countries where there's oil and there's often a lot of bribery, and there's been some DOJ prosecutions because of that here. Was China a country where people knew before GSK that there was a lot of sort of endemic bribery going on?
Yes. China is well known, or excuse me, it's perceived to have a high incidence of corruption. And I think 60% of FCPA enforcement actions over the past 6 years have been all or in part for companies work in China. So it's well known, and indeed I think even travel agents were well known for this. I quoted a gentleman who said travel agents are like ATMs in China, and if it's that well known in the industry or in any industry, then you've got a problem.
These people on the ground who enacted the bribes, what did they get themselves? Did they get anything out of it? Did they think they were stealing to help their own company?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, but it's overlaid by the following fact. We really had 3 separate sets of bribes and corruptions going on here. We talked about the bribe that the Chinese operation did, the bribes and corruption to gain greater market share through the selling of prescription medicine in China. But the business that the travel agencies did was so lucrative for the travel agencies that they actually bribed GSK employees in China to get the business. This included cash payments, it included gifts, it even included sexual favors that were offered to employees. So we had a second level of corruption going on, but then you actually had a third level of corruption, which was the Chinese operation back against their corporate headquarters or their corporate operations, and it worked in the following manner. The travel agencies would put together a conference of 80, 100 people, and there would be actually 50 in attend. And they would bill GSK for the entire 100. And GSK would then get that money paid from corporate and pay it to the travel agencies. And the travel agencies would use the difference to fund the bribery activities going forward. We found there were some instances where conferences that GSK paid for never occurred. Hotels where they were alleged to have happened had no record of ever doing business with GSK.
Well, and if I read your book correctly, they could partially do that because there are people selling receipts all over China?
Yes, the business of fake receipts in China is apparently a huge problem. And it generally revolves around or is because the Chinese tax authority bases the taxation rate they set on whatever is on the sales receipts. So you're charged some percentage of the sales. And so once you have a receipt, then the Chinese government figures out how much to tax you. So people will gin up fake receipts, or conversely get fake receipts to turn into companies to their employers for services. And sometimes, unfortunately, apparently Chinese governmental officials will sell fake tax receipts that company employees in China will use to generate fake income.
Wow. Different kind of street vendor, I guess, over there. That's really interesting. So what should American and UK companies take from this? What do they need to do now that they see what's happened in China and what change could be coming from that?
Well, the first thing they need to do is, if they have a Chinese operation, they need to immediately go in and see if they're doing business with any travel agents. If they are, they need to stop and audit those travel agents. But within the broader context of China, they need to also test their employees' expense reports to see if any of this fraudulent activity was going forward, and monitor, audit, put under a microscope their entire Chinese operation, because the Chinese government is looking at them. They're sharing information with the U.S. Department of Justice. They're sharing information with the Serious Fraud Office. If you're doing business in China, you may be subjected to a multitude of jurisdictions who will prosecute you with multiple investigations and indeed multiple fines and penalties. But beyond China, I think that companies need to understand that going forward, domestic governments may take a much closer look at bribery and corruption. So if you're in India, if you're in Central Asia, if you're in West Africa, you need to go in there and make sure your operations are as clean as you can make them.
And what's happened to GSK, given that they had such a good paper policy, does that lessen the chances of paper policy being a good defense to the FCPA in any way?
Well, a paper policy is no defense to the FCPA. What the Department of Justice wants to see is an effective compliance program. I think 5, maybe 10 years ago, the Department of Justice would say if you had a paper program, that was going to be enough. But as FCPA enforcement has increased, as the department has become more sophisticated and mature in their thinking about compliance programs, they've really challenged companies to prove that their program is effective, and they require the proof through documentation. So I say the most important 3 things in FCPA compliance are document, document, document. Whatever you do, document it, because if a regulator comes knocking, they're going to want to see your documentation, not to hear that we have a program, here's the paper program, and we are an ethical company. You've got a document to show that you are.
So as opposed to GSK sort of ruining for other people who have compliance, they're the canary in the coal mine telling everybody, hey, it doesn't matter just what's on paper. You could lose a lot here, not just in China, but when the other prosecutions come from that.
That's absolutely right. The Department of Justice, I think, views corruption as integral to U.S. security. And as part of their ongoing effort, they have trained regulators and prosecutors across the globe on anti-corruption and anti-bribery. And I think certainly with the Chinese regulators, we're seeing some of that come home. And I think that the Chinese regulators are going to be sharing information with the Department of Justice, and that you're going to see more international enforcement efforts and more international cooperation.
Yeah, that's got to feel different, the Chinese government giving the DOJ a case. You also mentioned in your book board of directors and potential liability for them. What was your point there?
Sure. Board of directors have increasingly important roles within companies, increasing potential liability. But specifically within the compliance world, board of directors need to take an active role in their compliance programs. And I do not mean that they need to get into the weeds and actually do the work of a compliance officer. Their role is there as a board as oversight. If a high enough risk is involved, the board needs to know about it. The board needs to see the results of monitoring. They need to see the results of testing. The board needs to have risk assessments done to make sure that the company is properly managing its own risks. In addition to the greater liability that's come up, certainly after Enron with Sarbanes-Oxley and now Dodd-Frank, I think insurance companies are actually now starting to not provide coverage in shareholder derivative actions to board members where the companies do not have an effective compliance program, so that in addition to potential criminal liability under the FCPA, admittedly that's something that hasn't happened yet, this could really hit directors in their pocketbooks. So they need to be aware of this, and they need to be asking these questions.
Well, that's pretty fascinating, the idea that the O&D policies are going to be a fight before the fight if there's a shareholder derivative lawsuit.
Sure. We've had one example where there was a shareholder derivative action during the pendency of an FCPA investigation. Typically, they're after the investigation is concluded, because when the investigation is concluded, the company's admitted they've at fault. Plaintiffs' lawyers don't have to prove a lot once the DOJ has done the work for them. So typically it's a follow-on lawsuit, but we have had them in the middle of these actions.
Huh. That's pretty interesting. Well, in sum, what do you think, what did you hope people would take away from your interesting ebook?
Well, my hope is that the takeaway number one, that anti-corruption and anti-bribery enforcement is going to increase worldwide in scope, and companies need to be prepared for it. It really doesn't matter what your policy says, is your policy effective? Those are sort of the overarching themes I'm trying to get across. And then last, that I think countries are going to start taking corruption and bribery very seriously. And I would give the unfortunate example of what happened in Kenya last week with the massacre at the mall. One of the allegations made is that the arms that the terrorists used were smuggled across the border through bribery and corruption. I think the U.S. government views porous borders as a security problem, and that they will use whatever tools available to them to try to combat that, one of which is the FCPA. And if you take that the step further that the department seems to have taken, is to train other prosecutors and other regulators in bribery and corruption legislation to prosecute companies, so that I think prosecutions will continue to increase going forward.
Okay. Hey, thanks for your time, Tom.
Mary, I really appreciate it. And if anyone would like any more information, they can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thank you very much.